Thank you for joining our presentation, Be Gay, Do Crime, the Revolutionary History of Queer Young Adult Fiction. Over here we have my colleague Chloe, a PhD candidate from the University of South Australia. She is doing a creative writing thesis on intersectional representation in queer young adult fiction.
Thanks, Alex. And this is my colleague Alex from the University of Canberra. They're doing a creative research project exploring the trickster character in queer YA. We would like to acknowledge today that our work was produced in the lands of the Ngunnawal and Kaurna peoples. We pay our respects to Ngunnawal and Kaurna elders, past, present and emerging, and to the importance of all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and knowledges. These lands were never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. We're talking to you today about LGBTQIA+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual plus characters in YA fiction. Our collaborative presentation charts a brief history of Western queer YA, from tragic public novels through coming out and acceptance stories to radical queer stories rejecting the heteronormative status quo. We mark this evolution or revolution with story conventions, cliches and tropes over the decades from 1969 to now. Alex will begin at the beginning with trends in the late 20th century before I jump in at the 2000s to bring us to now. We conclude by explaining why novels breaking the molds before them is so significant to telling queer stories. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. When discussing the origins of YA fiction with queer characters, general consensus points to John Donovan's novel I'll Get There, It Better Be Worth the Trip, published in 1969, the same year as the New York Stonewall riots. This novel, coming into the world in the same year as Stonewall, is a coincidence, but speaks to a cultural shift wherein queerness was becoming more visible, whether the normative powers that be liked it or not. While Donovan's novel was revolutionary for its time, in retrospect, it has some issues, discussion of which helps to crystallize the state of queer representation in fiction at the time and in the decades that would follow. During the 1960s and 70s, YA was emerging as a distinct genre, and with it a tradition that many scholars and commentators call the problem novel. These were novels that sought to delve into issues affecting real contemporary teenagers, at their worst ending up with an overt didactic, moralizing tone intending to warn readers against certain behaviours. With queer sexuality becoming more visible in popular consciousness, homosexuality, which sounds a little clinical now but was the go-to phrase at the time, often found itself positioned as the problem in a problem novel. Jenkins and Cart note the uptick of this particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, but cite I'll Get There as a sort of blueprint text. As Jenkins and Cart outline, quote, the characters are male, white, and upper middle class. The physical nature of what happens between them remains obscure. A cause and effect relationship is implied between homosexuality and being the child of divorced parents, more specifically having an absent father and a disturbed and/or controlling mother. Homosexuality is presented both as a rite of passage experience with no long-term meaning or consequences, and as a matter of conscious choice. A crucial thing to also mention is the ideological connection that emerged between queer experience and death. While none of the human characters die in the novel, the narrative draws a cause and effect relationship between the young protagonist experimenting with his sexuality and his beloved pet dog getting hit by a car. Needless to say, the relationship between the two teenage boys does not end with a happily ever after. Next slide, please. So many negative narrative traditions emerged in this early era, following on from censorship conventions such as the Hays Code or caveats of various publishing houses, and entangling with that supposed didactic purpose of fiction for young readers. Paraphrasing from Jan Goodman's article, Out of the Closet But Paying the Price, these included that aforementioned connection between queerness and tragedy, codified these days as bury your gays, just a phase logic, portrayals of queerness as something a character could catch, like a cold, from either a traumatic experience, a fractured home life, or from another person, and something that, like a cold, they could recover from by the end of the novel. An association between queerness and a profound outsider status. In Goodman's words, gay people lead lonely lives even if they're happy with each other. An association with queerness as something profoundly adult, and if not downright inappropriate, inherently mysterious to pre-sexual people. Again, borrowing from Goodman, quote, "As far as young children know, there is no such thing as a gay person. Following from that, there is certainly no such thing as a gay child." Finally, while this was not universally true, and there were many books with queer protagonists, including our very first example, I'll Get there was a trend of queer characters not getting their own voice in the narrative. Many novels have, once more, that perceived didactic function, and novels with a presumed heterosexual audience would often have their presumed heterosexual protagonist observing gay side characters who would function as teaching tools of tolerance, acceptance, or in some cases, educating readers about what it means to be gay or trans or etc. Next slide. There were some sympathetic texts that broke the mold across this period. For example, Nancy Garden's 1982 novel Annie on My Mind was unusual for its era because it featured not just the teenage lesbian characters, but an older couple, showing that queer characters could exist as adults and there was a potential future for the characters' relationship. Cart and Jenkins also note the perks of being a wallflower as somewhat of a turning point in the 90s because of the sympathy with which the gay character is treated. Even when he does the unthinkable by kissing the straight protagonist, said protagonist accepts and supports his friend and his queer identity with a real nonchalance, a real sense of it not being a big deal, something that skewed or outright rejected many tropes that were prevalent at the time. I draw your attention to these conventions and cliches because they're not frozen in the past, and in many ways they are still hanging over many modern representations of queerness in fiction aimed at teenagers and in the media more generally. It's important to understand the foundations on which the current wave of queer YA is built and how exactly these are starting to be much more overtly questioned, problematized, or outright subverted. So as we head out of the 90s and into the 21st century, slowly the death grip that many of these historical tropes have on the expectations of queer teen narratives are loosening as we move away from problem novels and just-of-age logic into more nuanced explorations of queer coming of age. But for that, I will pass you back over to Chloe.
Thank you, Alex. So in the 21st century, minor and major LGBTQIA+ characters existed, and to an extent, with less questioning of their existence than decades before. The greater representation of at least the G and L of the LGBTQIA+ community in media, and the realization of the purchasing power of the community stimulated their assimilation into mainstream culture. In this time period, many queer YA stories often replicated gay assimilation, as we'll call it, by treating its LGBTQI+ characters, often cisgender, white gays and lesbians, as just like everyone else or trying to fit in. If their sexuality or gender experiences were acknowledged, it was superficially to avoid flaunting it, as quoted by Jenkins and Cart. By the mid-2000s, the reappearance of just happens to be gay became a trope. Characters who just happen to be gay happen to deviate from the heterosexual norms of attraction, but otherwise conform to their heterosexual peers. This reinforces homonormativity, privileging the norms and values of heterosexuality and expecting them to be replicated by homosexuals. Not all just happens to be gay stories were about assimilation, though. Some novels showed sexuality didn't have to be a source of conflict. For example, David Levithan's Boy Meets Boy on the Screen from 2003 demonstrated how queer literature could embrace otherness and resist heteronormative culture. Levithan blurs fantasy with realism by presenting an almost utopian setting where a town where gay and transgender students are accepted and celebrated. In this era, we saw that the most common story, and we still see the most common story given to LGBTQI+ people in queer YA was the coming out narrative. Coming out stories continue to be valuable for LGBTQ people, but positioning the coming out of characters as the climax reduces opportunities for LGBTQ+ characters to explore what happens after coming out. In the 2010s, coming out stories continued, but often modeled more positive experiences of coming out. The novels at this time show the growth in character-driven LGBTQ+ fiction, following characters through the process of coming out, rather than, quote, being simply plot or problem-driven novels ended with the characters coming out, end quote, from Jenkins and Cart. The coming out story is so pervasive in queer YA that authors Bill Conisberg and J. Robin Brown flipped the structure by featuring teens going back in the closet in their novels Openly Straight 2013 and Georgia Peaches and Other Forbidden Fruit 2016. The book covers are on the slide. The shift in how these stories are told signaled their enthusiastic reception by readers, especially LGBTQIA+ readers. In the 2010s, we saw more diversity of genders and sexualities in YA with trans, intersex, bisexual, and more main characters. They too, though, relied on coming out narratives, introduced problematic tropes, and prioritized a cisgender heterosexual audience for a while. Queer YA has continued to expand its genres beyond contemporary realism to speculative and historical fiction and beyond. Melinda Lowe's queer Cinderella fairy tale retelling, Ash, from 2009, shown on the screen, creates a fantasy world without homophobia, demonstrating how authors play with traditionally heteronormative stories. Lowe also features the YA trope of a love triangle, but with a bi-protagonist torn between two different gender love interests, showing how these authors start to queer common tropes we see in YA. Moving into this decade, authors of queer YA are breaking the molds of heteronormative storytelling and pushing beyond limiting queer YA narratives and tropes. Alison Evans' magical realism novel Euphoria Kids from last year follows three friends, a trans girl, trans boy, and a non-binary character as they learn spells. Evans' novel is revolutionary for avoiding a coming out story or it just happens to be gay trope, whereby the trans characters, their transness informs their character and their relationship to magic without it being the sole characteristics or story. Evans, in an interview in Books and Publishing, said, quote, "Writing about gender euphoria comes from a place of wanting to write about trans characters for a trans audience," end quote. Euphoria Kids is an example of queer YA own voices from Australia. On the screen, we have two other recent examples, Boy from the Mish by Indigenous author Gary Lernsberg and Peter Ler's Rady Normal by neurodivergent author Anna Waitley. Writers of queer YA are playing with popular tropes in ways that offer new possibilities for queer characters, especially those of colour. Leah Johnson's 2020 novel You Should See Me in a Crowd follows Liz Leidy, one of the few Black students at her white privileged small US high school, as she runs for prom queen for tuition prize money. Johnson uses the competition to lovers trope to explore success and failure and other questions. As we've alluded to, intersectional representation is growing in queer YA, and we can see the demand for more stories from diverse perspectives in lists like those shown on the screen, naming books with people of colour protagonists, queer Indigenous fiction, fat positive characters, disabled characters, and queer Jewish narratives, and many more stories. Another popular trope in recent queer YA is found families. It reflects the importance of social networks for LGBTQIA+ young people. Some titles exploring this trope include Johnny Garzavia's 1500 Miles from the Sun, Caleb Rowick's Death Prefers Blondes, C.B. Lee's Not Your Sidekick, Aisha Monet's The Black Veins, and M.K. England's Disasters and Spellhacker. In these found families, we see an ensemble cast of characters of different genders, sexualities, and identities, displaying some of the diversity of the LGBTQIA+ community. Many of the novels mentioned involve marginalized characters committing crime. M.K. England's Spellhacker, for example, is a fantasy heist underdog story uncovering conspiracy and corruption. A marginalized group standing up against hegemonic authority takes us back to our roots in LGBTQIA+ activism. These novels are expressing the radical narrative that the systems do marginalize those that fit in and fighting against those systems. This is what we mean when we say be gay to crime. After decades of gay assimilation stories, queer YA has moved into a period of queer radicalism and celebration. Teenagers can now have these books in their hands. Some may even find them in their school libraries and classrooms, not to mention the adult readers of YA taken on this journey of queer radical self-determination. But some authors of LGBTQIA+ fiction still face censorship and quiet policing. We hope for more LGBTQIA+ stories, for more messy, troublemaking characters, for more readers to see themselves, for more authors to share their voices, and for these stories to be visible to as many people as possible. Thank you so much for listening. Please contact us if you would like references from our presentation.